I grew up probably like you in the 1950s and 1960s America. So my parents were the post-Depression, post-war generation. When they grew up, they were in the Depression. There wasn't a lot of variety in food. And then during the war years, certain things were rationed, and the dairy industry and the corporate food industry really got a strong grip on the country and started making margarine because no one could get butter, that kind of thing. So by the time I came along, this was normal to eat food that had been highly processed and was perhaps a substitute for the types of whole foods that my grandparents' generation had grown up on. So, and that was just normal in 1950s and 1960s America. But for some reason, I was the kind of kid who at the breakfast table would be eating my Cheerios or my whatever it was, the Frosted Flakes. And I would always read every word on the cereal box. I had to read every word. And so I read all the ingredients. And you may recall, if you did the same thing, that there was a tremendously long list of stuff that was a total mystery. So it just came out of the chemistry lab and you had no idea what it was. And I remember sitting and thinking, I wonder what all that stuff is. What does it do for me? Why is it necessary in the food? And then when I was 18, the summer after high school, I had a boyfriend who was a few years older than me, and he was investigating macrobiotics. He was studying macrobiotic foods and cooking, and introduced me to this whole different idea about food. And I was fascinated. I didn't go whole hog for being macrobiotic, but I was quite fascinated, and was introduced to the idea of natural food stores. But there wasn't much around where I lived. I lived near Washington, D.C. at the time, and there was not much in suburban Maryland that made those kinds of things available. But lo and behold, at age 19, 1972, along comes in my neighborhood a little chain vitamin store, which this company no longer exists. I think they were gobbled up by GNC at some point, but they were called Nature Food Center. And they had, they're actually more interesting than a GNC. So pardon me, GNC, but it's true. And they had very interesting stuff. They had, maybe 40% of their stock was supplements and bodybuilding materials. But they also stocked a lot of whole foods. There, in those days, it was Shiloh Farms on the East Coast that made the best bread I'd ever had. And then there were things like pure goat ice cream. Awesome stuff. And while I worked there, I got a job there, and while I worked there, I worked for a very creative woman who was my boss, and I became the assistant. And we transformed the store further in the direction of food. We brought in produce, and we brought in the output of organic farms, and we brought in, and nobody knew what organic was then. It didn't have a definition, but we and our friends had some idea of what we thought organic was, so we brought in stuff that was nominally organic and certainly was probably more pesticide-free than the other produce that was available. So we started produce. We started bringing in more and more herbs of exotic types, and we started bringing in more cheeses. And that was back in the days before we all had pocket calculators, and we had random weight cheese. And to save time, I taught myself how to do complicated math in my head so I could calculate the weight and price on the random weight cheese without resorting to long division. And I got really good at that, so I can still do that. And the herbs, similarly, the bulk herbs. We were near Washington, D.C., and so we were able to connect with the nascent businesses in the Black Muslim community there, and they made wonderful products. We brought in all the produce of Shabazz Bakery, and that got to be very popular, and they made this wonderful submarine sandwich, whole wheat loaf, and we got into the business of making these awesome submarine sandwiches. I could give you the whole menu still.
And you've got quite a memory.
And, yeah. And the cool thing was, now you have to think about this in terms of what the inflation rate has been since 1972, okay? So think about when we started that store, the sales, the gross income for the store was about $2,000 a week. And we pushed it in very short order up to $10,000 a week.
Wow.
And our parent company, NFC, did not know what we were doing. They had to send people to investigate why we were so successful. And it was obvious. We were selling real food, and we loved it. And the customers loved it, and the community came in. And one of the joys of working in natural foods I discovered while still a teenager was talking to the older people. So you think of us now as pioneers in our field, but at that time, the older people were my pioneers. And for example, the old Farmer John, we never knew his last name, and he used to come in, and there were certain things he always got, and I would always help him because he was totally grumpy and no one else wanted to deal with him. But if you really showed an interest in him, he would open up and talk about farming and how he did things. And then my special joy was there was a whole collection from our area of these older Black ladies whose families had lived there for I don't know how many generations. And they had all this herbal lore that I knew nothing about. And they had different names for the herbs that I'd never heard. And I'll confess, I used to try to eavesdrop on their conversations with each other so I could learn things. I was just fascinated with them and their ways of speaking. So I was having a lot of fun, and I loved it. And then I transplanted to the West Coast, and at age 23 was just audacious enough not to know that it was hard to start your own business and make it succeed in a small timber town in Oregon. So not knowing that I would fail, I did that. and didn't fail, although we came darn close to it for a while. I'm going to pause here and ask you, so how did you get started in all this?
Well, I too read the cereal box, but I was not making any connections about chemicals. I was just bored. And so I came here, I think I was 20, to visit a friend who had moved here. A whole lot of us I worked in a free clinic in Southern California, and a whole group of us decided that we were going to move to Oregon after the executive director of the clinic moved to Oregon. We came to visit him and went, whoa, it's gorgeous here. It's beautiful. And the people were friendly. They'd let you in traffic. They'd let you use the bathroom if you're shopping. It was a whole different world where people were kind. And I really, really liked it. And so I was in Eugene for a while, and I had an opportunity to move to the country and move to this place. I rented a place on Railroad Road in Cottage Grove, and I got hired as the executive director of the helpline in Cottage Grove, and it was a typical helpline where people call in suicide and drug abuse and all kinds of things that people have issues with. And so one of the things I did was I, as the new executive director, I trained a whole lot of ladies who went to church, nice white liberal Presbyterians and Methodists that were living down there who wanted to help people. And I trained them about subjects and issues that they were not familiar with. And there was a history with this hotline, and part of the history involved you. And you used to be the training coordinator. And I had just come to town, and I was shopping in your store, and I guess somebody had told you that I got hired.
Someone told me that you were the new director, and the former director, well, I'm not going to go into all the chicanery that went on before you came along, but I was really hoping that what the people who originally founded the helpline, including myself, had envisioned could be revived, because the outgoing regime had destroyed it.
Yeah.
And so I was really hoping to connect with you, but I didn't know, I'd heard your name, but I didn't know how to reach you. So she came into my health food store and bought something and wrote a check for it. And when I saw the name on the check, I'll never forget
You kind of
this.
accosted me.
I'll never forget this, because I was supposed to be assisting the director with debriefing and keeping people focused on the helpline, and I had been shut out. So when I saw the name on the check, I said, "You're Amber," and she goes, "Yeah, yeah." And I said, I didn't know, I was so overcome, I just didn't know what to say or how to explain myself. I said, "I'm supposed to help you."
Well, that's great. And as it turns out, in a much bigger way in my life, you have helped
We
me.
have been helping each other ever since,
Yeah.
throughout the natural food industry. So, yeah.
Yeah, and so I got my natural foods, and I got an assistant in the process, and in the process of rebuilding that organization. When I inherited, they had interviewed me, and I had a lot of social service experience from working in the clinic and other places I volunteered, and they passed me. I didn't make the first cut. They hired this woman who, her big experience was that she was a Boy Scout leader, and so she emptied the financial. She drained the finances and tried to turn it into a religious hotline, and it had county money, and county money has to be,
Non-sectarian.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was funded with public money, and it had to be non-sectarian, and so they brought me in to build it back up and turn it into, county sanctioned. And you helped me do that, and that was the beginning of our relationship. And it wasn't enough money for me to live on, and so you hired me to help do window dressing.
Yes.
At night. We were the elves at night, so we would go rebuild the window out at the retail store at Sunshine General Store that you owned.
That's right. I hired you to be the behind-the-scenes project elf for the store, and to do whatever needed doing that didn't involve the daily chores.
Yeah. So that was really helpful, because it supplemented my income. And somewhere along there, I also started teaching preschool. So I'm kind of a Jill of all trades there. I kind of do a lot of things. But I also did childcare for conferences and events. And since I was working at a preschool, I had some experience. And didn't you hire me for childcare for Spirit Path?
Yes.
Yeah. So there were we had some overlaps there where I was working conferences as a childcare person, but also I have a lot of different skills, so I would volunteer to help with registration, or to help with putting packets together, or anything.
So in 1990, I was newly hired to be the grocery manager for Sundance Natural Foods. And I was attending a trade show in the Tacoma area. And at the trade show, it turned out to be convenient that we convene a Provender board meeting in my hotel room. Now, Provender Alliance was the educational association that was located in the Northwest and focused in the natural foods industry. This is not, as it turns out, something that is common in other parts of the world to have such an organization, and it has played a very key role in making the Northwest a leader in natural foods. So during that board meeting, we needed to hire a conference coordinator, and everyone was in despair because they just didn't know anyone who could have such a broad skill set to do all the things that we perceived needed to be done to make this a great conference. And I sort of quietly piped up and said, I know someone. You're like, who? Who? What god or goddess could possibly encompass all those skills? I said, well, at the moment, she's working a part-time shift in my natural food store.
I think actually, wasn't it at night?
It probably was.
Yeah,
and
because I think you woke me up.
They're like, no. And I had to convince them that there actually existed a human being who could do all those things with her hands tied behind her back. And they finally said, all right, how do we get hold of her? I said, well, we pick up the phone and we dial her. And we hired you over the phone and brought you into the Provender organization as the conference coordinator, later to become executive director when we were able to fund that position. But
that wasn't the first time I'd had any relationship with Provender.
No, we should go back.
As it turns out.
We should go back to the inception of Provender, how it came about and why it existed at all.
I went to the Equinox gathering in Puget Sound in, I think it was 1977, it was put on by a group called Cascadian Regional Library, or CAROL, and it was, the purpose of it, as I understood it, was to talk about appropriate technology and how do we share the skills that we have, how do we create a better web for food, and power meaning like utilities and things like that. And I was working with Community Energy Bank at the time. It was a skills exchange, and I worked with the folks at the Growers Market building, and they were, the Cascadian Regional Library was right next to the office for Community Energy Bank. So I wanted to go to this conference because I was really interested in what CAROL was doing, and I wanted to find out more about appropriate technology because I'm still a relative noob in the Northwest, and I want to know how the Northwest does things because I didn't like how it was where I came from. So I went to this conference, and I didn't know, I was not part of the Provender group that formed out of that, but I was there, and I discovered later that Provender had been founded at the very same conference where I was. And as it turns out, you said you were there as well? We didn't meet. But
Interestingly, now that you say that, I'm remembering that there were 2 Equinox gatherings, one in the spring and one in the fall. And I went to the one in the fall of 1977, which was in Molalla, Oregon.
Oh, so I went to the spring and you went to the fall.
Yeah,
okay.
That's why we didn't meet.
I'm still following. No, this time you're following me.
Yeah.
Usually I follow you.
Yeah,
but yeah.
or I might have been reversed. I don't know. But anyway, I heard about the Equinox gathering, and so what is the Equinox gathering? I asked my friend, who said, well, it's calling itself the Northwest Alternative Food System Network under the auspices of Cascadian Regional Library. So of course I wanted to know about that, and I arranged to leave my store for the weekend and my natural food store and attend the Equinox gathering. And it was a very interesting conference. It was a little overwhelming for me. I felt that so many people there were way more politicized than I was, and I was a little overwhelmed. But it was an eye-opener, and I did hear, and then there was discussion about having ongoing meetings, and that the role of Cascadian Regional Library, how they saw themselves, was to, and Cascadian Regional Library basically consisted of Marshall Landman and Judith Gill. Marshall from Oregon and Judith from Washington. And how they saw themselves was getting things rolling. They were not proposing to become part of a continuing organization, but
They were facilitating.
they were wanting to facilitate conversations that would lead to ongoing networking in the Whole Foods industry in our area. So what came out of the discussion there was that the way to continue, it was determined that growers, farmers, and dairy people, and what have you, that farmers' needs and interests were going to be radically different from that of processors, distributors, and retailers. And so it was decided to form two organizations. And what was born out of that was the Provender Alliance, which was then called the Northwest Provender Alliance, and TILF, and Provender Alliance remained a pan-Northwest group, including Idaho, Northern California, anybody. And then eventually it's now just Provender Alliance, and anybody from anywhere can join, although most of the membership is from the Northwest. TILF, however, found it necessary because of how they wanted to operate, the farming and gardening group, that they had to form two different organizations, one based in Washington and one in Oregon. I don't believe Washington TILF still exists. It might, but I haven't heard anything about it in a number of years. Oregon TILF continues as an organic certification agency, which has operations that potentially are worldwide. They've just become known in their field for organic certification. And so if you have a product that has a little seal on it that says OTCO, that's the Oregon TILF Certification Organization. So what Provender developed into, and it took a couple years to hit its stride, but out of those meetings, out of the Equinox gatherings, and specifically out of some of the people who were aligned with those caucuses who had to break out in order to feel empowered, came some very skilled people. Lori McLean comes to mind, Teresa Marquez, who basically became the face of Provender for a few years, organizing meetings, publishing an outstanding journal that came out quarterly. Was Grace part of it at that time?
Might have been part of it.
Grace Cox from Olympia.
I saw people who came at this and were in the business not because they were in the business. The business was part of making sure that people had good, healthy food. And so the goal was really not the business. The business was a vehicle to get natural foods in the hands of people, because natural foods were not easy to come by still. We had one distributor, what was it, Woofy? No, it was North Coast Express.
And we were buying from the group in Arcata, and they were called United Naturals. And the reason that sticks in my memory so well, their driver was Theo. And
Theo from here?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, from Arcata. Theo's schedule, his delivery schedule was such that the only time he could make deliveries to our store was at midnight. And so we talked to Theo about this ourselves, and this was the relaxed way things were in those days. We're like, hey, we never lock our door. We'll put the key in such and such a place. You let yourself in, make the delivery, bring the key back to our house, and then you can crash in our living room for the night.
That was the natural foods industry. That's what we did.
For a year and a half, Theo made deliveries in the middle of the night, and he'd be sleeping on the sofa when we came downstairs in the morning. We'd make breakfast for him.
And Huey Lewis delivered yogurt for Nancy's Yogurt. Springfield
Huey Lewis
Creamery.
in the news.
I mean, it was laid back. It was not about business. It was about access.
It was about both, I felt, because it was about creating a new way of doing business, that we could support ourselves, we could support others with the commerce, and we could do it in a way that was humane for everyone and healthy, and that's what we wanted.
And we used to say, I mean, how often did we say, you know, someday we're going to work ourselves out of a job because everyone will be able to have access to clean food, to good food. And I mean, I am not a person who I never liked the cookies that didn't taste like anything. And I mean, I got into natural foods. I mean, I got into eating natural foods because they tasted good. I mean, there was a whole bunch of stuff that we used to call cookie-free cookies that didn't taste like cookies. They tasted like flour and hard things, hard crunchy things. And I really liked natural foods that actually you wouldn't, if you had a choice between something that your mom made or something that, you know, that you really, at a good restaurant and a natural foods product, you might even pick the natural foods product, whether it had dairy in it or not. And I had people say to me, so are you on a non-dairy kick or something? It's like, no, I eat this thing with tofu because I like tofu. So sue me. You know? and tofu tastes good.
Yeah.
It doesn't always taste good. You have to fix it right. But I came at it from a more aesthetic point of view, as well as, I mean, I wanted to be healthy, but I'm not going to eat rocks. I'm sorry, I'm just not going to do it. I don't care if it's the most healthy thing in the world. It's got to taste good. And so I was really lucky in that a lot of those things came along, and manufacturers were starting to make their food taste much better about the time I started doing it.
There was a time when Provender actually played a small role in something that was very important for the nation, and Tilth played a somewhat larger role. But basically, what it came down to is this. In 1988, 89, you might remember there was the big Alar scare where
Right.
Moms were discovering that this really toxic chemical was on the apples in their applesauce that they were giving their babies, and fortunately we had a celebrity who got involved in that. That was Meryl Streep. Thank you, Meryl. No, I don't know her personally. I just remember that she was a spokesperson about this problem with the apples. And of course, those of us who had espoused eating natural and organic foods for a long time were like, well, yeah, thanks for finally getting on the bandwagon. You know, so we could use a few more voices like that, because it really became big news then that this was a potential problem to be feeding children, me too, stuff that really actually wasn't good to eat. And so out of that, there developed suddenly a much stronger interest in organic food from people who didn't understand what organic food was, but assumed that meant it was without chemicals. And suddenly it was hard to keep organic foods in stock. And of course, growers and manufacturers were scrambling to meet the demand and having a good time doing it, I would assume, as we all were. It's like, wow, we have new customers. This is great. But what happened was it gave some leverage to the awareness that we needed to have a legalized standard for what constituted organic food. We did not have that. It had never existed. It was just sort of a popular understanding or misunderstanding, as the case may be, about what food ought to be. And so the conversation began in various parts of the country. And remember, this is before the internet. This is before you had any way to communicate someone except meeting them, talking to them on the phone, or writing them a letter and sending it in the mail. So some of the conversations were about, we really need to get this codified in law, because right now, anybody can put anything on whatever they're growing, bring it to you, and sell it as organic. We don't have any way to prove that it isn't. And so one of the great minds of our time, Lynn Cody, who was also an old friend of mine, who was working as an organic agricultural consultant, and I believe probably still is, in 1989, 1990, she began meeting together with one of our local organic farmers here, Jack Gray of Wintergreen Farm. And they were working out, and organically grown company was also involved. They were working out and drafting proposed legislation at the state level to define organic standards at the state level. And they were both tilth participants, Oregon Tilth. And I got wind of what they were doing, and I showed up at their meetings and said,
I'm crashing this party.
I'm crashing this party because I'm the president of Provender this year, and manufacturers and retailers and distributors need to be part of this discussion, because we have to have this standard defined in a way that works all the way through the food chain so the consumer knows what they're getting. And they acknowledged that that was a wise choice, and they included me in the meetings. Now, my role compared to theirs was quite minor, because they had already done a lot of the footwork and knew what they were doing at that point. But there were some important contributions that I made as Provender member, and I pulled in Harold Tobin from Serrata Soy Foods, who was at that time with Serrata Soy Foods, to represent the manufacturing side, to point out to them, for example, you cannot say that every single ingredient in an organic food must be organic, because when we make tofu, for example, most of it is organic, but we're using water. The water has to be described some way, and we can't call the water organic. And we're using nigari, which is made from seawater, and that's what's used to curdle the soy milk into tofu. It's only about 0.5% of the finished product, but it's in there, and we can't label seawater organic. There's no way to define that. So after several more discussions, we were able to include in the legislation a better definition of what growers would do, what the farmers would do that could be called organic, what retailers would do in order to be called an organic retailer, of which there are a few, and what food processors or manufacturers could do, and how they could label things, and what percentage of non-organic product could be in something that was called organic, and what sort of non-organic ingredients were permissible. And that all got worked out, and it was a pretty good law, and we took it to the Oregon State Legislature, and by golly, they passed it first shot. And we had
It was very well written.
and we had a consumer who showed up at our last meeting and chimed in and said, I want to know that we're going to know X and Y as consumers when this is done. And we realized we couldn't promise that. And Lynn started talking about, and this is the first time I had heard the word that is now everyone's catchphrase, which is sustainability. Lynn started explaining that what we had to do was we could not label something organic as being chemical free. That wasn't the point, because there are also organic chemicals like rotenone.
Uranium's organic.
Yeah, uranium is, there are naturally occurring biological agents that are used in organic farming, but the difference is they do not persist in the environment. They break down very quickly into non-toxic substances, and they don't deplete or damage the soil, water, or air. And so she began using, and this is the first time I'd ever heard this used, she started using the term sustainability to talk about what organics was about. So from that point on, I began promoting both within Provender and on a broader level, the idea of selling organics not as something that had an absence of pesticides, but as something that was promoting sustainability in a holistic way, where the land, the air, and the water are cared for. So the following year, an effort was convened on the national level to draft organic standards legislation. And while that was going on, an interesting thing happened within the industry. a major retailer in the Northeast, who shall remain nameless, came out in all the trade journals with their op-ed opinion about how the legislation that was being drafted was going in the wrong direction. They were saying that what we needed was to be able to assure our customers that organic food was chemical-free, period. And there's no way to guarantee that. There can be pesticide drift, et cetera, et cetera. You hope it's minimal, but whatever. Anyway, there was no way to guarantee that. And this got published in the trade journals. And I, as the Provender president, that would totally wreck everything we're trying to do. It's not practical, for one thing. You cannot guarantee that there was never any kind of chemical that got near your field.
In the background.
You can do your best, but you can't guarantee that by the time it gets into the apple bin, that someone hasn't touched it somewhere along the line with a trace of chemicals on their fingers, whatever, in the air. And so that's not the way to describe it. Even though it's more likely to be chemical-free, that's not the way to describe it unless you want a whole lot of lawsuits going on.
And it's not the whole story.
Yeah, and it's not the whole story. It doesn't really describe what we're trying to do, where we're going. So this was still back in the day, no internet and no electric typewriter even. I mean, they existed, but I didn't own one. And there was no one else around to take up this charge, so... And in fact, that was the year where for several months I wasn't working in a regular job, so I didn't have a business to call on for their resources. And I sat down with an old clunky manual typewriter and I composed a letter that I wanted to go to every retailer and person in the industry, that just as that trade journal had done. And then I took the letter to Sundance because I thought they would help. Thank goodness for Sundance Natural Foods. I talked to David Resegi and he said, I think I can get you a printout of most of the retailers in the country. I'm like, you can? I don't know how he did it. But he did give me this long list, and I sent it to every retailer that I could find, hundreds of people. This is me making photocopies by hand, stamping letters, writing addresses, sending this everywhere. And I sent it also to the people who were drafting the legislation, so they would be included in every step of the conversation. And I sent it, one of the people I sent it to was Tom Forster, who was actually in Washington, D.C., working to lobby for this. And he was so kind as to send me back a letter, because I told him when I sent it to him, I've sent this to all the people in the industry I can find. Please get on board with what you're trying to do. And these are the reasons. And I was able to say, in the Northwest, we are fortunate to have created, and I called it a vertical integration of ideas in our industry. The retailers, the manufacturers, the distributors, and the growers are talking about what works and what doesn't, and what our customers need to know, and what our overall view is. And we're looking at this holistically. What we want to focus on is creating sustainability, not avoiding chemicals. And I was much more eloquent than that. And I sent it everywhere. I sent it to Tom Forster. I told him I'd send it everywhere. I got a letter back from him that said, thank God you're doing that. He said, I can't believe that op-ed that came out. He said, it really is getting in our way, because people will listen to that unless someone like you talks to them. So I was very glad for that, and I felt like I played a small role in getting all the players on board with what had to be done. So.
And that's really that's another thing that I like about this group, about having Provender as a resource, is that you're not the only person who has a story like that.
Right.
Where people feel that the very atmosphere, or the fact that Provender's there and the context within which Provender operates empowers people to do that. Well, okay, so this isn't working, so what can we do about this? What can you do? And people will say, okay, I will do this part, I will do this part. And you were right at home in that kind of environment because you're the kind of person who says, well, I have to say something about this. I can't rest unless this is taken care of. And there are other like-minded people who are with you with that, like Craig Winters, you know, some of the other folks that we've worked with over time that really stood up and said, hey, wait, no, here's where we need to be. Here's how we need to frame this argument, or here's how we need to put this, because it's more than just this granular little piece of profit.
Right, like the retailer from the Northeast had looked at it through one particular lens, and I had been fortunate because of the connections we built in the Northwest to see it through several different lenses throughout the food distribution system, and go, whoa, that is not going to work.
And here you are advocating for junk in the food.
Yeah.
You know,
not really, but
right?
yeah.
I know, but you know, it puts you in this weird position. But because you had this context around you, and you had people behind you that said, "Yes, Marty, yes," that also helps. And you had David. You know, David stepped up and said,
"Thank goodness."
Oh yeah, you know, and so I think that there still is a place for that. There still is a place for.
Grassroots?
An organization like Provender that tells people you have permission to go out and make something change, and we will stand with you. You know, we will stand with you if you're supporting this concept of like the web. You know, of us being connected together, and sustainability, and well-being and health in all areas, not just in food or in your pocketbook, but you know, in your psychic and your whole mental health. And as I'm rambling off of rambling, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So that it's in that context that having permission to do as an individual an important work, knowing that you have these people behind you.
Yep. So a little more about the origins of the Provender Alliance at the Equinox gatherings. As I mentioned before, at the Equinox gathering, it was determined that TILS would form for the farmers and Provender would form for the people focused in making and selling natural and organic foods. So the manufacturers, the distributors, the salespeople, which later became brokers, and the retailers, and more people are included in that, but I'm not going to get into all the details. So what was interesting about the Equinox gathering was that, you know, I mentioned before that I was astonished because a lot of the people there wanted to have far more political conversations than I was ready for. But I realized over time that that was a necessary part of what we were doing, because what we all did share was a holistic view of what we were trying to do. That being able to sell great supplements and awesome food is a wonderful thing, but we wanted more than that. We wanted the whole enchilada. We wanted sustainable treatment of our land, air, and water. We wanted compassionate and sustainable treatment of each other in the business model. We wanted compassionate and respectful treatment for all the participants in the industry. We wanted perfection, but that's okay. We may or may not have realized we couldn't always have perfection, but working toward it was something we all shared. That we wanted to be inclusive, and we wanted everyone to have a place at the table. And I appreciate that more and more as time goes on, and as I have been in and out of different parts of the industry, some of which I felt were doing a more or less good job of holding all those values, and some which just seem to care about part of it and not the rest. And I'm still someone who would like to see the whole thing. But at any rate, Provender came out of it for all the people who wanted to focus their attention, even though they espoused all those same goals. Provender, in my mind, was for the subset of that group that wanted to focus that through selling and making food. Distributors, retailers, manufacturers. And so it began as a way of educating one another and communicating one another, congratulating one another, and just basically a way of forming community so we didn't all feel so alone with trying to create this model that we had never seen.
Well, and there was not, the internet was not around then.
Right.
And I'm looking for someone who has a particular product or a spice or something. We had to write letters. I mean, you could not just, maybe you could call on the phone. I mean, but how are you going to know? So one of the things that Provender did and did well was it connected manufacturers with retailers and brokers and distributors, so that when retailers said, hey, my customers want, we want a pasta sauce that doesn't have any tomatoes in it. So we want to have a pasta sauce that's made out of squash or something like that. Well, if a manufacturer doesn't have a connection for a squash grower, for organic squash, or for whatever, there's no way for them. I mean, there's no way, but it's not easy. What we did was we made it easier for retailers to ask distributors for products or manufacturers for products, and we talked to distributors about getting products into distribution, such as Toby's Tofu Pate, and Toby was a really important part of Provender's history. But other places in the country couldn't get tofu pate until there was a way to get it distributed. And Provender was one of those connections for Toby. Same with the creamery, Springfield Creamery. Connections were made, and the economy of scale that was created when we all came together made the whole Northwest natural foods industry more efficient and made it better in terms of our ability to meet the needs of people who wanted natural foods. So, my stated goal and what I understood was that we were focused on getting good food to people, whatever that took, and that the business was secondary to that. Although we needed to have the business to be able to support this process, what was in our hearts was that we wanted people to have good food. And we used to say that over and over again, when are we going to work ourselves out of a job and everybody will have natural food? Who knew it was going to be like this? But this is before corporate America discovered that this was a profit center. I feel like that was one of the advantages of organizing with Provender, and it also educated. We were allowed to educate, not allowed. We gave each other information that we had, and we organized around issues. For example, some of the supplements manufacturers were getting hammered pretty heavily about regulations that were making it difficult for them to sell their products. And we had consumers that really wanted, customers that wanted certain supplements, and they were going to be gone. And those people were really helped with those things. And so one of the things we were able to do with Provender is organize people, or to give them information and connections to get information to give to consumers, so that consumers could lobby the government to say, hey, we do need this. We need this particular supplement. Here's how we can do it. So we created a structure and a support system for natural foods to become more available from the Northwest, and that was our goal, and I think that in some ways we met that pretty well. Don't you think?
Yeah. When you talk about working ourselves out of a job, just a quick aside, but when I was still a teenager on the East Coast, I actually had a dream in my sleep one night that I walked into the local convenience store and that it was, and this is like back in what,
Back in the Stone
1974 or something, you know, that I walked into the local convenience store and that there was a mix of products on the shelves. They had junk food right alongside natural food everywhere you looked. And I remember thinking, wow. And I woke up and I thought, I wonder if that could ever happen. So
Yeah, okay.
now we have, you know, every Safeway has a major section of natural or organic foods
Pop-Tarts, they're natural.
mixed in. So, you know, it actually became that. Where
That wasn't really how we wanted it to be, but, and also a lot of the people that are making the big money on it are not the people, not the farmers and the small manufacturers. They don't make the money out of it until they're bought out by some corporate overlord. But
Yep.
but still, I think that educating each other about, I think that educating each other and connecting with each other was one of the most powerful things that Provender has done in terms of being able to make a powerful voice and there's a facilitator for people who want natural foods and people who want to give natural foods to them. And Provender has held that space very well. I mean, I haven't been active in Provender for a while, but the Northwest natural foods industry is in pretty good shape.
Yes.
I'm pretty proud of our folks.
Yeah, we did well through a couple of recessions and everything. The things continued to grow. So it was from Provender, which came out of the Cascadian Regional Library Equinox gatherings, that I ended up meeting people who taught me a lot of what I knew about how I did my job, about making my business work better, about how when you get to the point where you're managing people, how do you do that in a professional and humane way, and still remain on good terms. Not always possible, but you do your best. And it was basically, it was so many people who went there have a similar story to mine, that without attending Provender conferences, without meeting the people they met there, they would not have had a career, and our industry as a whole in this area would not have prospered. And we did manage to do that in an area that had for a few decades there was going in and out of recession quite a bit. We did fine. And so I'm really grateful to it. And it may be, for what it's worth, I'll offer my perspective on a political aspect of this. And I mean politics with a big P, is that it does matter who you elect in some cases, because the existence of Cascadian Regional Library, it was a project that was funded from the CETA program, which was inaugurated by the Carter administration and taken away afterward. And the CETA funds funded a lot of small business enterprises to get them off the ground. It was sort of a New Deal kind of thing. And in some cases, once the funds were taken away, the business was not able to stand on its own, and it disappeared. In many cases, it found a way to survive and prospered, as was the case with Provender. So Carroll, the Cascadian Regional Library, was disbanded, but all the projects that Carroll started, wisely began, continued under their own steam.
I was hired by Community Energy Bank under
CETA.
Mhm.
Yeah, back when we had an Office of Appropriate Technology in Eugene.
That's right.
Yeah,
WT.
it was an amazing time.
Well, and as time went on, one of the things that we built in to the Provender conference was we brought in consultants like Carolee Coulter and Vern Ho, and people that were providing just exactly that, business training. How do you handle personnel issues? How do you handle things fairly? But bringing in someone who wasn't just a stock, like Robert Half person or something. It was, Carol Lee knew what we were doing in the natural foods industry. She was one of us, and still she had these skills that people really clamored for. And there were other business, margin and markup, and how do you do that? And we had roundtables and panel discussions where retailers would talk about different ways that they manage their perishables, or how they handle shrink, or do they use markup? Do they use margin? What's the difference between those two? And those are for some people, they needed that information because they just sort of figured out what they wanted to charge for it, and they charged for it. And we taught people accounting, and I mean not accounting, but basic bookkeeping that you can do in terms of a conference weekend, but other things about how do you relate to a broker versus how do you relate to a manufacturer's rep. What's the difference between a manufacturer's rep and a broker's rep? What's the difference between, when I remember when I started that there was quite a bit of there were different set of goals and different priorities for all four of those groups: the distributors, the manufacturers, the brokers, and the retailers. And there were, I think that if I remember correctly, there were more retailers than any other group.
Yes.
And we had some brokers and some distributors, but we really had very few manufacturers. So I remember that my first year in Provender, my goal was to increase the number of manufacturers in the percentage. And we did that. But we wanted everybody at the table, and we wanted to have people ask questions of each other and say, for example, as a broker's rep, what drives you nuts when you come visit a retailer? What is it that you want the retailers to do to be ready for your visit so that you can have a productive visit and you can get what you need out of it, and that they can get what they need, the information they need. And same back with retailers. So what is it? Do you want somebody to just come drop a list of, when I was a buyer, I had a way that I dealt with reps just because of my particular schedule. I always said, come visit me, bring me samples, leave me a list. You don't have to go through everything. I'll ask you questions, and then I will call you in a couple of days. They knew that was going to happen. But if we didn't have that, I had permission to do that because I had learned that at Provender, that I could say to my rep, here's what I need from you. And the reps were happy. But if you just sat there and retailers would complain about, oh, he just talks my ear off, or I just don't, so we would have these round tables, and people said, you got all four groups all in the same place? I'd say, yeah, and they were fine. We picked people who we knew would be able to handle that sort of thing, and they handled it gracefully. And I thought that one of the things that we did very well was bring all four of those groups together. And we encouraged people to have direct communication with each other, because it wasn't always that way. And people get hired as buyers in retail stores. They don't know what to do. They're just, somebody just says, here, you fill the shelf. And so being able to teach a retail buyer, how do you approach somebody at a trade show? What do you do, how do you set boundaries with that? Or how do you get what you need from that person? And that you can go to a manufacturer like Rising Moon. Remember Kirk and Rising Moon? I loved their pasta sauce, and I knew that I could sell their pasta sauce, and I knew that I could sell their ravioli, but they weren't in Mountain People's Warehouse, and Mountain People's Warehouse was our primary distributor. So every gosh darn trade show, as a retailer, I took my Sundance badge and said, I'm a retailer here, and I want you to carry this product. Here's some ravioli. Here's some bread and taste it. And I don't think I was the only person who got them in there, but one of the things that we did at Provender was we talked about your responsibility to make things better. Because, for example, when I was a buyer at Sundance, that was a big deal at a trade show because we did a lot. We did 6 million in natural foods in under 1,200 square feet, which I think is more productive per square foot than any place outside of New York City. And so when I had the Sundance buyer badge on, people wanted to sell stuff to me because they knew I could move product. And so we at Provender encouraged people that were retailers or that anybody that had any kind of influence to use it for good. So find a small company that you really support and get other retailers to try their product and get them on the bandwagon, and then go to Mountain Peoples and say, hey, we will carry this product. We will sell this product if you will carry it. And that, I think, is one of the things that Provender did so well, was kind of grease the wheels to get people connected, but not in a sleazy way. It was a friendly way, it was kind, and it was, I don't know, it felt like it was comfortable. It was not creepy.
It's like, how can we make this work for everyone? And that was one of the wonderful things when you would try to explain why someone might want to be involved with Provender and say, you know, this is a place where companies that are competitors come together and cooperate. Mm-hmm. This is the place where we all get to breathe, instead of saying, how do I beat that other fellow at this? That was a place where you and the other fellow could be, and forget about all that and say, how do we lift up our whole industry? Mm-hmm. What's going to work well?
How do we solve mutual problems?
And it was very, very good because it created a lot of cross-pollination and idea exchange that helped us all. So, mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it was we were lucky in that we had good board members. Most of our board members were just so supportive, and we had a period of time where we decided that we needed to expand, and they decided to make my position full-time, and it required some seed money, and there were companies and individuals who pledged money on a monthly basis to pay my salary to prime the pump, and I was full-time for I don't even remember how long, but we put money into the bank. We became very stable's not really the word, but I mean we were built on a solid foundation, and we moved forward, I think, with a lot more confidence and a lot more support, and I was really grateful that we had the board members we had, because we had some pretty stellar folks that really they were very committed, and not they were committed and skilled, and if they didn't have the skill, they'd find the skill. And you were one of the most steadfast board members, and even when you weren't on the board, you were a really great person to bounce things off of, because you had this perspective, and you owned a business, and you had all this information that I didn't have, that's for sure. What we did was, or I guess I'm assuming what they still do, is we created a community, and it was a community of people who shared a set of goals, and the goals were about helping each other out rather than stepping on each other or being worried that the person next to you is going to steal your idea or take your business. But it was more about we come together because we have this common set of values, that people matter, that food is important, that clean food is really important, that being well is a really important part of life, and that's all connected to our food system.
And that our participatory management, where everyone has some say in what's going on, graduated, but that there is feedback, and feedback is allowed, you know.
Yeah,
that was important.
It's not an oppressive environment to work in.
Right, that we want to create work environments that are more collaborative.
Mm-hmm. So it's health, not just from the food, but in the meta, for the psychological part.
Right.
Not an abusive place to work.
Right. It's like we're not abusing our bodies with bad food. We shouldn't be abusing each other either.
My belief is that we were not. Yes, we were stepping away from something the way that it was, that we felt was not healthy. But my belief is that we were going towards something different and better. That we weren't just running away, we were creating something new. And so when you go to a Provender conference, you were part of creating something new, or something better, that had more parts of it, more parts of yourself were going to be included in the agenda than just the part that goes, hey, I got something, build some muscles, It was a whole sort of thing. Down to the food that we served. The food was always a challenge, and we'd have a lot of donations, and that was another way that we supported our manufacturers, and our brokers supported us by bringing food. And I think that they don't do that anymore, but
there's some of that. They have a snack room now, I think, at Hood River, so that can still happen. But I think I did attend the Hood River event one time, and it's amazing. They've worked with the staff at the Hood River Inn long enough now that the kitchen knows exactly what to do.
That's so great.
And it's pretty darn good.
Because we were out in the middle of...
We were always having to reinvent the wheel without the facility to do it in, yeah.
There was one place that we were, remember the place where we were, it was up, I think it was Port Townsend, and they had never done a conference like Provender before, and they thought that the reason we were not using meat was because we were too poor. So for breakfast one morning, they brought those big trays of bacon and set them down in the breakfast table.
Carts full of bacon.
And it was a gift. They didn't put it on our bill, and they were telling us, we wanted you to, we felt like we wanted to give you this gift. And the entire Sundance delegation got upset and walked out. Nobody knew. They thought I had ordered this as the...
Yeah. And certainly not everyone who attended was vegetarian, but we needed to make sure that we had that
meals.
We needed to make sure we had that covered, and that no one was going to be confronted with meat when they didn't want to be. So,
and it was I just about lost it. But then we also were able to do Lost Valley, where we could bring in our own chef, and we brought in Anton from Holy Cow, yeah. And Anton is such a character, and he would walk in every year. He would walk in. He'd say, "I can't possibly work in this kitchen. There is no way I cannot feed people in this kitchen. This kitchen is too small, or the refrigerator is not big enough." Or he would have his fit, and then he would go produce this incredible food, and then of course he would say, "I want." Of course, I want to do this again next year. And so we had the two choices. Either we had to work with people who had no idea. They thought natural foods was like iceberg lettuce and grilled cheese sandwich, or just salad for 3 days.
Yeah, just salad. Yeah. Nothing but salad.
And so we had to kind of introduce people to tofu and tempeh and some of the other more exotic sort of things like wheat meat, and then get them to not just use it, but do it well, because the people that we were serving were natural foodies. They wanted decent food, and they deserved it.
They had a finely trained palate.
Yes, they did. They certainly did, yeah, I mean, I really liked the conferences we did at Lost Valley, but Lost Valley was a conference center, still is actually, out in Dexter, and there were so many, it was pretty free-for-all, so we had a lot of opportunities, but there were some basics that we had to figure out, and I mean...
And it's rustic, to say the least.
It is rustic. And
I was close to primitive, so...
Their bunks and things. And I mean, they were comfortable bunks, but then, they would forget things like they forgot the year they forgot the linens, And we showed up on, I think it was Wednesday night. The conference was starting on Friday, and Wednesday I said, so you're going to have all these, we're walking around in the dorms, and I said, so when did the linens go? And they said, you're bringing your linens. And I said, no, we're not. And they said, oh yeah, we didn't plan for linens. And I whipped out the contract and said, right here, linens. And they said, oh, okay. And they started running around to everyone who lived in the whole community. And they all had to give their sheets up, and they did laundry and laundry and laundry.
Oh, dear.
And they finally got, I mean, we got enough sheets, but it was touch and go. So, I mean, we also had the food that we wanted, because we had Anton and we had manufacturers bringing food. So the food, even though Anton complained about it, was absolutely exquisite.
It was good.
And so it was always this choice between how primitive do we go, and then we also get all these choices, or how mainstream do we go, and how much, what are the limitations on the food?
have certain aspects of our conference taken completely out of our control.
Exactly.
I think that is resolved. I suspect that's a big part of the reason that they have stuck with Hood River now for umpteen million years, because the Hood River Inn has learned to do what is needed.
Yeah, that's great.
And they're willing to do it.
Because it was, I mean, in those days, it was not, people did not know what tofu was in a commercial kitchen, unless it was an Asian kitchen. And it was always kind of like talking to Martians. I mean, they were looking at us like we were nuts.
This is a good story about why eat natural. Best story I ever heard, and it's from Doug Green, who started New Hope Communications, published The Natural Food Merchandiser. One year he was the keynote speaker at the Provender conference, and he basically told us his history with natural foods. He had had a career as a high-level salesman for a chemical company that made all those additives that get put in food. And so he had this route where he would call on the executives of these major agribusiness food manufacturers, who shall remain nameless, but you know who they all are. And he got very mysteriously sick. And he was getting sicker and sicker and sicker, and he had to take some time out. And so he went to recuperate, I think on a beach in Mexico or something. This was part of his talk. And he befriended another vacationer while he was there, and they were chatting, and the other guy was really healthy, and Doug was not. And the other guy got to talking to him about, well, what do you eat? And Doug said, well, what does everybody eat? And he told him, and the guy goes, oh boy, that might have something to do with why you're not feeling good. And the guy basically gave him an education in natural foods, and Doug thought, well, that's weird, but I'm not getting any other answers that are working for me.
Nothing to lose.
Nothing to lose, so I'll try it. And he put himself on an entirely natural food diet with as much organics as he could, eating whole foods. And he said at first it was kind of odd, but then he really started liking it. And his health came back. He was fine. So one day he was doing his job, and he called on the executive at a major food manufacturer to sell his chemicals. And he kind of liked the guy. The guy was intelligent, and he enjoyed talking to him. And he just sort of asked him a candid question when they finished their meeting. He said, tell me, why do you guys put all these chemicals in the food? What's it for? Why, we don't need this. Why do that? And the executive just looked at him in astonishment and answered him very candidly and said, we're not in the business of selling food. We sell image. And that just had such an effect on Doug. He's like, I'm in the wrong line of work. So we have Natural Food Merchandiser. Anyway, I love that story. And maybe you'll actually interview Doug at some point and you'll tell it differently, but that's what I heard.